in the vast and blood-soaked empire of ancient Rome, where emperors ruled like gods and lives were reduced to whispers in marble corridors. One name rarely surfaces. Sporus. He wasn't a senator or a general. He never led legions or conquered distant lands. Yet his story may be one of the most haunting testaments to what power can do when stripped of humanity. It begins in 65 AD. The Roman Empire stretched like a golden crown over the known world, from the misty hills of Britain to the sun-scorched banks of the Euphrates. On its throne sat Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, emperor, artist, tyrant, madman. To the outside world, Nero was power personified, a ruler drenched in luxury. He sang on stage, designed palaces with ceilings that rained perfume, and walked through Rome like a living god. But behind the walls of his opulent golden palace, Domus Aurea, something else festered, something darker. The kind of madness that didn't shout but whispered. And into this world stepped Sporus. He was a boy, perhaps no older than 14, born a slave, later freed, living quietly inside the imperial household. To most, he was invisible, just another beautiful face in a palace crawling with them. But to Nero, he became something else entirely. Ancient writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe Sporus with phrases that seem more myth than memory. Ethereal beauty, soft features, a presence so delicate it almost didn't belong to this world. He didn't seek attention. But in a palace ruled by whim, even existing could become dangerous, especially when the emperor's heart had shattered. Just a year before, Nero's second wife, Poppaea Sabina, had died. She had been the great obsession of his life, seductive, ambitious, and feared. Some say she died from complications during childbirth. Others claim Nero struck her down himself in a fit of rage, kicking her while she carried their unborn child. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. Nero was undone, grief twisted into obsession. And obsession needed a form. That's when he saw Sporus. It might have been a glance across a hallway, a moment in the shadows of the palace gardens. But Nero saw something, a resemblance, a flash of Poppaea's beauty in the boy's face. And that was all it took. Nero, grieving and spiraling, hatched a plan so disturbing it seemed born not of mourning, but madness. If he could not bring his beloved back from the dead, he would rebuild her, piece by piece, and Sporus was to be the canvas. The decision was brutal and swift. Without consent, without ceremony, Nero ordered Sporus to be castrated. In the cold marble rooms of the palace medical quarters, imperial physicians did what they were told. There was no mercy, no regard for the young boy's screams, only silence muffled by thick stone walls and imperial will. That day, Sporus lost more than his body. He lost his name, his future, his identity. What came next wasn't grief. It was theater, a twisted spectacle wrapped in silken jewels. Nero announced he would marry Sporus, publicly. He declared the boy the new Poppaea, gave him her name, dressed him in her gowns, hung her jewels from his ears. The wedding was no private fantasy. It was a state affair attended by senators and courtiers, forced to play along in a ceremony so surreal it bordered on sacrilege. Rome watched, stunned. Here was the emperor, veiled like a groom, and beside him, Sporus, painted, powdered, cloaked in a dead woman's memory. The marriage vows were spoken, the rituals completed. Applause echoed through the palace, and behind it all, Sporus stood silent, swallowed by layers of silk and sorrow. From that moment on, he was no longer seen as a person. He was an empress, a ghost, a symbol of love so toxic it needed to devour another soul just to stay alive. In public, Sporus appeared beside Nero at theater performances and banquets, paraded like a prized possession. A living doll, a resurrected memory. Every gesture, every glance had to mimic the woman he was forced to become. He was expected to speak in her tone, walk in her grace, smile in her silence. The world saw a beautiful young woman at the emperor's side, but they knew. They knew the truth behind the illusion. And that knowledge, unspoken and unbearable, made the spectacle even darker. Roman citizens, no strangers to imperial excess, whispered their disgust. Senators gritted their teeth behind forced smiles. To them, Sporus wasn't just a boy in a dress, he was a mirror reflecting the depths of their emperor's unraveling mind. And Sporus? He played his role. He had no choice. He was now Sabina, Nero's beloved bride. But he had also become something else, something terrifying. A reminder that in Nero's Rome, even your own body wasn't truly yours. Even your soul could be rewritten. Even death could be defied, if only in the most grotesque of ways. And as Sporus sat beside the emperor, dressed in Poppæa's stolen robes, he must have wondered, was there anything left of the boy he used to be? Or had he already vanished, lost to history, to madness, and to the cruel theater of a man who mistook obsession for love? Sporus had once been a boy. Now he was a monument to grief, to madness, to the terrifying truth that when emperors lose touch with reality, it's the innocent who pay the price. After the wedding, the palace changed, not in its marble or grandeur, but in atmosphere. Servants lowered their eyes, advisors avoided direct speech. No one dared speak of what had just happened. Sporus, now dressed as Poppæa, was not merely tolerated, he was revered, addressed as Lady Sabina, bowed to, obeyed. The emperor had spoken, and in Rome, when the emperor speaks, reality shifts to match the sound. Behind the veils and silks, Sporus learned the art of surviving inside a role no one would ever escape from. He dined with senators, sat beside Nero during performances, was offered gifts, greetings, even poems, written not for who he was, but for who he had been forced to become. He was never asked if he was in pain, because pain was irrelevant in Nero's court. Only appearances mattered, and Sporus's appearance was perfect. But perfection was a prison. Every day was an audition with no script, a life lived on a stage where a single misstep could bring wrath. Nero expected not just obedience but devotion, not just femininity but the exact echo of Poppæa, her voice, her glances, even her scent. At court, some whispered that Nero spoke to Sporus in private as if he were truly speaking to his dead wife, that he apologized for past arguments, that he asked for forgiveness, that he wept. But Sporus, he could not weep. His tears were invisible, buried beneath powder and perfume. And in those moments of eerie tenderness, when Nero caressed his face or whispered secrets into his ear, Sporus must have felt something worse than fear. He must have felt nothing. Because how do you hold on to yourself when your body has been changed and your name stolen? Nero, as always, oscillated between extremes, one moment doting, the next dangerous. If Sporus made a wrong gesture, if he failed to laugh when expected or frowned too long during a speech, Nero would rage. There are reports of screaming fits, of thrown goblets, of hours-long lectures about Poppæa's real grace. It was a cycle Sporus could never escape. Love, reward, punishment, repeat. And all of Rome watched, not in sympathy but in silence. Because to pity Sporus meant to acknowledge what he represented, that none of them, no matter their rank, were safe from Nero's madness. Even foreign lands weren't safe from this bizarre spectacle. When Nero toured Greece, another one of his theatrical adventures, he brought Sporus along. Dressed as an empress, draped in fine fabrics, painted, perfumed, and smiling for diplomats who did not dare flinch. The Greeks, masters of drama, surely recognized the twisted theater before them, but they clapped anyway. Because in the empire, truth bowed to power, and Sporus, He bowed too. He bowed before governors, dined with kings, rode in litters through cheering crowds. But beneath the garments in gold, he was still just a boy stolen from himself. And the mask he wore? It wasn't made of paint or silk, it was carved from trauma. The most chilling truth about Sporus's life wasn't that he had been mutilated or forced into marriage or paraded as a woman. It's that, over time, the lines between the role and the reality began to blur, even for him. Who was he now? Was he still Sporus? Was there even a Sporus left? Or had Nero's fantasy consumed him so completely that he too had forgotten who he used to be? Some say there were rare moments when the mask slipped, when Sporus was alone, or thought he was. A flinch when touched, a tremor in his voice, a stare that went too long. The hollow kind of gaze only found in those who live as someone else's idea of perfection. But most of the time he performed. Because the truth was, performance had become survival. The palace wasn't just filled with marble and gold, it was filled with fear. Everyone, from slaves to senators, knew that Sporus's situation was only the most visible symptom of the empire's sickness. Behind him, Nero's empire was unraveling. The Great Fire had already scorched the city. Nero's public performances, once tolerated, were now a national embarrassment. Taxes soared, rebellions brewed, even the military was losing patience. Rome needed leadership, and their emperor, he was too busy playing house with a ghost. Sporus had become the face of that decay. To the public, he was a curiosity. To the court, a scandal. To the emperor, a lifeline. Because Nero, for all his cruelty, truly believed that through Sporus he had resurrected Poppaea. He believed her spirit lived behind those eyes. That when he kissed Sporus, he was kissing the past. That their love could be reborn through force of will alone. But love built on delusion is never love. It's just another form of control. And for Sporus there was no escape. Not through pleading, not through rebellion, not even through silence. Because silence too was a statement in Nero's eyes, and every reaction Sporus gave or withheld became part of the performance. This was not a relationship, it was possession. And Sporus, he was no longer a person, he was a stage, a vessel, a beautiful broken mirror, reflecting whatever Nero wanted to see. But mirrors crack, and even the most fragile, silent ones can shatter. By 68 AD, the empire was bleeding, not from war, not from plague, but from rot at its very core. The Senate muttered behind closed doors, the provinces whispered rebellion, and Rome, once the heart of the world, was cracking under the weight of one man's fantasies. Nero had gone too far. The fire that had once lit the skies now smoldered in every soul. The emperor who played the lyre while the city burned was no longer a myth. He was the reality. And right beside him, still draped in silk and shadows, walked Sporus, still called Sabina, still smiled upon in public, still forced to be the living echo of a love long dead. But behind every public appearance there was panic. Nero's paranoia grew like ivy, curling into every corner of the palace. He distrusted his generals. He lashed out at advisors. He staged private performances for dwindling crowds and demanded laughter even when none came. And Sporus? He stood beside him, his expression carved from ritual. He had been transformed from a victim into a symbol. A tragic icon of Nero's madness, now whispered about in corners and laughed at behind goblets. Senators looked at Sporus and saw not beauty but instability, not elegance but the emperor's unraveling. To many, Sporus was proof that Nero no longer ruled the empire, only his own imagination. The Praetorian Guard turned. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. And when the rebellion came, it came fast. One moment Nero was sipping wine and reciting poetry. The next, he was running. Through the night, with a small group of loyal followers, he fled his golden palace, his golden statues, his golden life. And clinging close behind him, as always, was Sporus, still dressed in the garments of an empress, still pretending to be someone he never chose to become. This was the true heartbreak of Sporus's story. Even as the world fell apart, even when escape might have been possible, even as swords sharpened in the distance, he stayed. Because where else could he go? Who would take in a boy with no name, no voice, no past? Who would care for a person who had become nothing more than a performance? In those final days, Sporus watched a god become a ghost. Nero, once terrifying in his command, was reduced to hiding in gardens, begging friends to help him die. When the news came that the Senate had declared him a traitor, when even his servants began to flee, Nero made his final decision. Death. On June 9th, 68 AD, he took his own life with the help of a loyal aide. And in the silence that followed, Sporus was alone, truly alone, but not free. Because even with the emperor gone, Sporus's nightmare wasn't over. He wasn't a survivor. He was a relic, a possession, a living reminder of everything the Romans wanted to forget about Nero's reign. He was passed like treasure from one powerful hand to the next. First to Galba, the new emperor, who claimed the boy like loot, not out of affection, but convenience. To Galba, Sporus was proof that Nero's rule had ended. A trophy, a curiosity. He kept him close, but never close enough to matter. Sporus still wore the remnants of his role, still dressed with feminine touches, still referred to by the names Nero had assigned him. But now, there was no illusion of love, only awkward glances and muffled laughter. The court didn't pretend anymore. They ridiculed him, and Sporus, trapped between memory and mockery, had no choice but to endure it all. When Galba was assassinated just months later, Sporus was passed again. To Otho. This man surprisingly showed something faintly resembling kindness. Perhaps he understood Sporus's pain, perhaps he recognized the fear in his eyes as something mirrored in his own. But Otho's reign, like all things in Rome that year, was brief. When he was defeated by Vitellius, the boy was cast into yet another layer of humiliation. Vitellius was different. He had no tenderness, no restraint, no interest in preserving Sporus's dignity, or even pretending to. He didn't want to own Sporus. He wanted to use him, to break him entirely. The emperor announced that Sporus would perform for the Roman people, but not on a stage, in the arena. A grotesque parody was planned, a reenactment of the myth of Persephone, the maiden dragged to the underworld, violated and transformed. Sporus would play the role of Persephone, live, in front of tens of thousands, for the crowd's entertainment. After everything, the mutilation, the forced marriage, the public lies, and endless charade, this was the final act. Not a wedding, not a performance, a violation, a public execution of dignity, and Sporus finally broke. After years of silence, of masks, of roles played and personas buried, of beauty twisted into performance, of love twisted into torture, Sporus made the one choice left to him. He took his own life. No speeches, no rebellion, just a quiet final act. Because even death in that moment was an act of rebellion, a reclamation, a final refusal to be someone else's creation. In a world that had stolen his body, renamed his soul, and turned his life into theater, Sporus did the only thing that was truly his. He ended the play. Sporus's death wasn't recorded with ceremony. No monuments were raised. No poets penned his name in verse. To Rome, he was a footnote, a forgotten ornament of a fallen regime. But that silence is where the truth lives. Because what Sporus endured wasn't simply cruelty, it was obliteration, not just of flesh, but of identity. He wasn't killed in battle, he wasn't condemned by law. He was consumed by the obsessions of one man and by the apathy of a society that watched and did nothing. And yet, he mattered. Because Sporus wasn't just a victim of Nero, he was a reflection of what unchecked power can do to the most vulnerable. He was the face of every life twisted into someone else's fantasy. Every soul forced to smile while breaking. Every person reduced to a role, applauded for becoming their own ghost. But Sporus never stopped being real. Even behind the makeup, even beneath the gowns, even as he was forced to bow and curtsy and laugh on cue. He was still there, somewhere. Flickering. His suicide wasn't surrender. It was the only resistance he had left. In ending his life, he ended the illusion. He broke the script. He refused to let his final breath be dictated by another. And in doing so, he claimed something Nero could never steal: choice. For centuries, Rome buried him under shame and spectacle. Historians dismissed him as a curiosity, a tragic joke, a grotesque footnote to an emperor's downfall. But maybe, just maybe, we should see him differently. Not as a forgotten shadow, but as a boy who faced down the most terrifying force in the world, the erasure of self. And though he couldn't save his life, he ended it on his terms. That matters. Because remembering Sporus forces us to ask how many others were lost to the whims of power, how many lives were rewritten, silenced, or erased, and how many like him fought quietly inside themselves for even the smallest scrap of dignity. Sporus didn't lead armies, he didn't change laws, but he left behind something more honest than any emperor's triumph. A final whisper in history's ear: I am not yours. And in that whisper, we hear not weakness, but the echo of defiance.